In the vast tapestry of biblical history, few figures stand as boldly as Samson, a man whose name has become synonymous with supernatural strength and tragic downfall. His story, woven into the fabric of the book of Judges, is one of power, passion, and divine purpose. Yet beneath his legendary might lies a tale of weakness, temptation, and redemption, a narrative that continues to captivate readers to this day. Samson's journey begins long before his first breath, in a time when the people of Israel suffered under Philistine oppression. In these days of turmoil, when deliverance seemed distant, a miraculous promise was given to a barren woman. An angel of the Lord appeared to her, foretelling the birth of a son unlike any other. This child was to be a Nazirite, set apart for God's service, bound by sacred vows that would define his life. His destiny was not merely to live, but to lead, to rise against Israel's enemies with a strength that could only be explained by divine intervention. From the moment of his birth, Samson was marked for greatness. But with great strength comes great responsibility, and the weight of his calling would prove to be both his gift and his burden. As we journey through his life, we will witness astonishing feats of power, moments of deep moral struggle, and a final act of sacrifice that cements his place in history. His tale is not just one of physical might, but of spiritual lessons, lessons of obedience, the dangers of pride, and the unwavering hand of God even in the face of human failure. Long before Samson performed mighty feats or became a symbol of strength, his story began with a promise, one delivered by an angel to a woman who had known only barrenness. In ancient Israel, where children were seen as a sign of divine favor, infertility was often a cause of deep sorrow. Yet, in the quiet suffering of one unnamed woman, God saw an opportunity to bring forth a deliverer for his people. One day, as she went about her daily life, an angel of the Lord appeared to her with a message that would change the course of history. "Behold, you shall conceive and bear a son," the angel declared, a proclamation reminiscent of the great promises given to Sarah and Hannah before her. But this child was to be different. He would not merely be a blessing to his family, he would be a savior for Israel. The angel gave clear instructions regarding the boy's life. He was to be a Nazirite from the womb, dedicated to God's service. This sacred vow came with strict conditions. He was never to drink wine, never to touch anything unclean, and most importantly, never to cut his hair. These outward signs were meant to reflect an inner consecration, a life set apart for a divine purpose. Overwhelmed by the vision, the woman hurried to tell her husband, Manoah. Skeptical yet intrigued, he prayed for the divine messenger to return, seeking further guidance on how to raise this extraordinary child. In an act of grace, God answered his prayer, and the angel appeared once more, reaffirming the instructions. Manoah, filled with awe, wished to prepare an offering, but the angel refused, directing him instead to present it to the Lord. As the flames rose from the altar, the angel ascended in the fire, vanishing before their eyes. In that moment, Manoah and his wife knew without a doubt that they had witnessed something beyond human understanding. In time, the prophecy was fulfilled. A son was born, and they named him Samson. As he grew, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir within him, a sign that his calling was not of man but of God. His strength, unlike any before him, would not be merely for personal glory, but for the deliverance of his people. Yet even from his earliest days, the weight of his destiny loomed over him. Would he remain faithful to his vows? Would he use his strength as God intended? The answers would unfold in the years to come, in a life marked by triumph, failure, and ultimately, redemption. From a young age, Samson was unlike any other. As he grew, so did his strength, a power that could not be explained by human means. The Spirit of the Lord moved within him, granting him abilities that set him apart from all men. His feats would become legendary, yet his life would also reveal a troubling contradiction. Though he was the strongest man alive, his greatest battles were not fought against armies, but within his own heart. The first glimpse of his extraordinary power came in a moment of danger. While traveling, Samson encountered a roaring lion. With no weapon in hand, he did the unthinkable. He tore the beast apart with nothing but his bare hands. It was a display of raw, divine strength, a sign of his calling as Israel's defender. Yet, in a curious act, he told no one of what had happened, as if the event was insignificant to him. His strength on the battlefield was just as fearsome. When faced with enemies, Samson fought alone, not as a commander leading an army, but as a solitary warrior, wielding power beyond comprehension. At one point, he struck down 1,000 Philistine soldiers using nothing but the jawbone of a donkey, a weapon that in the hands of any other man would have been useless. The Philistines feared him, not just because of his might, but because they could not understand the source of his invincibility. Yet, for all his physical dominance, Samson's spirit was unguarded. His passions often dictated his choices, leading him into dangerous entanglements. He was drawn to Philistine women, enemies of his own people, and time after time, his desire for them blinded him to the dangers they posed. His first great mistake was insisting on marrying a Philistine woman, ignoring the warnings of his parents. This union would lead to betrayal, violence, and a cycle of revenge that would follow him for the rest of his life. His strength made him fearless, but his confidence bordered on arrogance. He acted on impulse, trusting in his power rather than wisdom. He believed himself untouchable, failing to see that his true enemy was not the Philistines, but his own unchecked desires. This paradox, unmatched power paired with deep vulnerability, would shape the course of his life. Samson was chosen by God, but being chosen did not make him immune to failure. His story was only beginning, but already cracks had begun to form in the foundation of his strength. Samson's strength had already set him apart, but it was his pride that would begin a dangerous cycle, one that would intertwine his fate with the Philistines in ways he never expected. His desire led him to seek a wife among them, despite his parents' protests. To Samson, this was not a matter of faith or loyalty to Israel, but of personal satisfaction. He saw what he wanted and pursued it, convinced that nothing could stand in his way. As part of the wedding festivities, a great feast was held, a celebration filled with laughter, boasting, and challenges. Among the guests were 30 Philistine men who viewed Samson not as a friend, but as an oddity, an Israelite with unmatched strength, yet reckless enough to marry into their people. It was in this atmosphere that Samson, confident in his wit as much as in his power, presented them with a riddle, one drawn from his own secret victory over the lion. Out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. Unbeknownst to the Philistines, Samson had returned to the carcass of the lion he had slain earlier and found a swarm of bees inside, producing honey. He had taken some, eating it without telling anyone where it came from. Now he turned this private experience into a challenge, wagering 30 sets of garments that they could not solve it within 7 days. At first, the Philistines were baffled. The riddle was impossible to solve without knowing what Samson had done. But as the days passed, frustration turned to desperation. Rather than admit defeat, they sought another way, through his wife. They cornered her, threatening her and her family with death if she did not get the answer from Samson. Under pressure, she wept and pleaded with Samson, wearing him down day after day until he finally relented, revealing the secret. Armed with the answer, the Philistines approached him on the 7th day with smug confidence. What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? Samson immediately knew he had been betrayed. His response was sharp, filled with bitterness. If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle." Humiliated, yet bound by his wager, Samson was forced to pay his debt. But rather than accept defeat, he stormed off to another Philistine town, where he killed 30 men, took their garments, and used them to settle the bet. This act of vengeance marked the beginning of an unending war between Samson and the Philistines. His pride had led him to set the challenge. His arrogance had made him believe it could not be solved, and his wrath now turned his wedding celebration into a battlefield. This was not just a test of wit. It was the spark that would ignite years of bloodshed, betrayal, and destruction. And Samson, blinded by his own sense of justice, was only getting started. Betrayal had ignited Samson's fury, and once his anger was unleashed, nothing could stand in its way. The Philistines had humiliated him, stealing the answer to his riddle through deceit, and now they would pay the price. What began as a wedding feast ended in bloodshed, setting Samson on a path of relentless vengeance, one that would make him the greatest enemy the Philistines had ever known. When Samson returned to his wife's home, expecting to reclaim her, he discovered yet another insult. Her father had given her to another man. Enraged, Samson took his revenge in a way that was both destructive and humiliating. He captured 300 foxes, tied them together in pairs, fastened torches to their tails, and sent them running through the Philistine grain fields, vineyards, and olive groves. The land burned, their crops were destroyed, and an entire season's harvest was reduced to ash. The Philistines, desperate to restore their pride, struck back with brutality. They found Samson's wife and her family and burned them alive, hoping to end the conflict. But this only fueled Samson's wrath. He swore revenge and struck them with such force that many fell before him. The Philistines, realizing they could not stop him, sent an army to capture him. Fleeing to the land of Judah, Samson was confronted by his own people. Fearing the wrath of the Philistines, 3,000 men of Judah came to him, not to support him, but to surrender him. They bound him with new ropes and delivered him to his enemies, believing this would put an end to the bloodshed. But Samson was not meant to be taken. As the Philistines rejoiced at his capture, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him with overwhelming power. The ropes binding him snapped like burnt flax, and in the chaos, Samson found a discarded weapon, an ordinary jawbone of a donkey. In the hands of another man, it was useless. In the hands of Samson, it became an instrument of divine judgment. With nothing but this crude weapon, he turned on his captors and slaughtered 1,000 Philistine warriors. Their bodies lay scattered, and their army, which had come to claim him, was no more. As he stood amidst the fallen, he cried out in triumph, "With a donkey's jawbone, I have made them heaps upon heaps. With a donkey's jawbone, I have slain 1,000 men." But victory did not satisfy him. It only fed his growing arrogance. He believed himself invincible, untouchable, a man who could not be conquered. Yet even in his triumph, he faced a reminder of his mortality. Overcome with thirst after the battle, he cried out to God, realizing that for all his strength, he was still dependent on the one who had given it to him. God, in his mercy, split open the ground and provided water, reviving Samson's spirit. But the lesson was soon forgotten. Samson's strength had made him a legend, but his recklessness was leading him toward an inevitable downfall. The Philistines feared him. His own people did not understand him, and he stood alone, a warrior with no equal, yet vulnerable in ways he refused to see. His greatest enemy was no longer the Philistine army. It was his own unchecked desires. And soon that weakness would be exploited. Samson had faced countless enemies, yet none proved as dangerous as the one he welcomed into his own arms. His strength had made him unstoppable. His wrath had made him feared, but it was love, misplaced and blind, that would bring him to his knees. Delilah entered his life not as a warrior or a threat, but as a temptation. She was beautiful, cunning, and most importantly, she held Samson's heart in her hands. Whether his love for her was genuine or merely another indulgence in his reckless desires, one thing was certain: she would be the instrument of his downfall. The Philistine rulers, desperate to break their greatest enemy, saw an opportunity in Delilah. They approached her with an offer of unimaginable wealth. Each of them would pay her 1,100 pieces of silver if she could uncover the secret of Samson's strength. It was not a request. It was a demand. And for Delilah, the price was too tempting to refuse. Night after night, she pressed Samson, her voice soft, her touch familiar, as she whispered the same question. "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued." At first, Samson toyed with her, feeding her lies. He told her that if he were bound with fresh bowstrings, he would be as weak as any other man. That very night, she bound him while he slept, only to cry out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But when he snapped the bowstrings with ease, she realized she had failed. She tried again, pleading with him, weaving her deception with feigned hurt. This time, he told her that new ropes would rob him of his strength. Again, she tested his words, and again, he broke free. Yet she did not give up. She played her role well, a lover betrayed, wounded by his refusal to trust her. With tears in her eyes, she demanded honesty, wearing him down with her persistence. Samson, still blind to the danger before him, came closer to the truth. He told her that if his hair were woven into a loom, he would be powerless. She did as he said, yet once more, when the Philistines rushed in, he awoke and tore himself free. But Delilah was not finished. She had learned one undeniable truth: Samson could withstand any force, any battle, but he could not withstand her. She continued her pleas day after day, until his soul was vexed to death. At last, exhausted and unable to resist her any longer, he surrendered. He revealed the truth that had been guarded since his birth. "No razor has ever touched my head, for I have been a Nazirite, set apart to God since birth. If my hair is shaved, my strength will leave me, and I will become as weak as any other man." This time, Delilah knew he had spoken the truth. She sent for the Philistine rulers who came bearing silver, ready to claim their victory. That night, as Samson slept in her lap, she called for a man to shave the locks from his head. Stroke by stroke, his strength was stripped from him, and when his eyes finally opened, the power that had once made him invincible was gone. He rose as before, thinking he could fight, thinking his strength was still with him. But the Lord had departed from him. The Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and led him away in chains. The mighty warrior, the terror of the Philistines, had been reduced to a blind prisoner, all because he had trusted the wrong person. Delilah had done what no army could. She had broken Samson, not with swords or spears, but with whispers and deception. And now his enemies would make him suffer for every battle, every victory, every act of vengeance. It was more than hair that defined Samson. It was the vow it represented. A Nazirite was consecrated to God, bound by 3 sacred restrictions: no wine, no contact with the dead, and no cutting of the hair. These were outward signs of an inward dedication, a physical reminder of a life set apart. Samson had already broken the first 2. He had feasted among the Philistines, and he had touched the carcass of the lion he had slain. Only one vow remained unbroken, the one tied directly to his power. That night, as he lay asleep in Delilah's lap, the unthinkable happened. A razor was brought forth, and strand by strand, the symbol of his covenant was severed. The locks that had never known a blade fell to the ground, and with them, the strength that had made him feared among nations vanished. When Delilah called out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you," he awoke as before, ready to fight, believing his power was still his to command. But this time, something was different. He did not know that the Lord had left him. For the first time in his life, Samson was truly powerless. The Philistines seized him with ease, no longer afraid of the man who had once torn through armies. They bound him, gouged out his eyes, and led him away in chains to Gaza, the very city where he had once torn down the gates in defiance. Now he was their prisoner, their trophy, a broken remnant of the warrior he had once been. The loss of his hair was not just the loss of strength, it was the loss of his identity, the severing of the final thread that connected him to his divine purpose. His fall was not because of Delilah, nor the Philistines, but because he had slowly turned away from the very vow that set him apart. Yet, even in the depths of his humiliation, the story of Samson was not yet over. Samson, once the terror of the Philistines, now walked in darkness, not just because his eyes had been gouged out, but because he had lost everything that once made him great. The man who had torn lions apart with his bare hands, who had slain thousands in battle, was now reduced to a mere shadow of himself, bound in chains and led like an animal. His captors wasted no time in turning him into a spectacle. They paraded him through the streets of Gaza, the very city where he had once carried away its mighty gates in defiance. Now, instead of fleeing from him in fear, the Philistines laughed and jeered. Their greatest enemy was no longer a warrior but a trophy, a living testament to their triumph over Israel's strongest man. They dragged him to the prison, where he was put to work grinding grain. It was the labor of slaves, of the weakest, of women, and the feeble. The weight of the millstone was nothing compared to the weight of his shame. Day after day, step after step, he pushed in endless circles, lost in the darkness of his own regret. The silence must have been deafening. No more battles, no more victories, no more songs of praise. Samson, who had once believed himself invincible, now had nothing left but time. Time to think, time to mourn, time to realize how far he had fallen. Yet, even in his disgrace, something unseen was happening. The Philistines had stripped him of his pride, his freedom, his sight, but they had forgotten one thing: his hair. Slowly, unnoticed by his captors, it began to grow again. And with each strand that returned, so did something else, the stirrings of faith, the whisper of hope. Samson had lost his strength because he had taken it for granted, but now, in his brokenness, he remembered where it truly came from. His power had never been his own. It had always belonged to God. And though he had failed, though he had squandered his calling, he had not been abandoned. He could not see the faces of those who mocked him, but perhaps for the first time, he truly saw himself. A man who had been given everything, yet had thrown it away. A man who had relied on his own strength, only to find that strength meant nothing without God. The Philistines believed they had broken Samson. The mighty warrior, now blind and bound, had been reduced to a prisoner grinding grain like a common slave. But his story was not yet over. His strength had been taken, his pride had been shattered, but something deeper had begun to stir within him, something his enemies could not see. Time had passed, and Samson's hair, the outward sign of his Nazirite vow, had begun to grow again. The Philistines did not notice, nor did they care. To them, he was nothing more than a fallen enemy, a symbol of their victory. They had no idea that the God who had once empowered him was not finished with him yet. One day, the rulers of the Philistines gathered in the great temple of Dagon, their god, to celebrate their triumph over Samson. The hall was filled with thousands of men and women, including the most powerful leaders of the nation. Laughter and drunken revelry echoed through the pillars as they called for their greatest prize, Samson, to be brought before them. They wanted to see him, to mock him, to make a spectacle of the man who had once terrorized them. Led by a servant, Samson was placed between the great pillars that held up the temple. He could not see the faces of those who jeered at him, but he could hear their scorn, their joy at his suffering. He stood there, humbled, ridiculed, no longer the invincible warrior he had once been. And then, in that moment of deepest humiliation, Samson did something he had failed to do in all his years of strength. He prayed, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." For the first time, Samson was not relying on himself, not acting out of pride or vengeance alone. He was turning back to the source of his strength, the one who had called him before he was even born. His life had been marked by failure and recklessness, but now, in his final moments, he understood that his strength had never been his own. Placing his hands on the massive pillars, he braced himself and pushed. At first, nothing happened. But then, a deep rumble filled the temple. The stone groaned under the force. The laughter turned to screams as the Philistines realized what was happening. Samson pressed harder, pouring everything he had left into this final act. And then, the pillars gave way. The entire temple came crashing down, burying everyone inside, rulers, soldiers, nobles, and Samson himself. In his death, he accomplished what he had failed to do in life. He destroyed more Philistines in that single moment than in all his battles combined. His story did not end with shame, but with redemption. He had been weak, but God had been strong. He had been blind, but in the end, he saw more clearly than ever. Samson had been chosen to deliver Israel, and though his path had been filled with failure and regret, his final act fulfilled his purpose. His strength had always been a gift, and in the end, he used it not for himself, but for something greater. The Philistines thought they had conquered Samson, but in truth, it was he who had defeated them, one last time. Samson's story is one of paradox, great strength and deep weakness, divine calling and human failure, destruction and redemption. He was chosen by God before birth, set apart to be a deliverer, yet his life was marked by impulsive choices and personal desires that often led him astray. Still, despite his flaws, his name stands among the heroes of faith, a testament to God's ability to work through even the most imperfect people. For many, Samson is remembered for his raw physical power, the man who tore a lion apart with his bare hands, who struck down 1,000 men with a donkey's jawbone, who single-handedly collapsed a temple upon his enemies. Yet his true legacy is not just in his feats of strength, but in the lessons his life teaches. Samson was a Nazirite, dedicated to God from birth. His uncut hair symbolized this lifelong vow, but his actions often showed a heart divided. He touched what was unclean, pursued relationships with those who opposed his people, and placed his trust in the wrong hands. His downfall came not because God abandoned him, but because he slowly compromised the calling placed upon him. His life serves as a warning. Great gifts do not guarantee great faithfulness. Strength without obedience is not enough. Though Samson fell, his story did not end in disgrace. His final prayer, his final act, was one of faith, trusting in God's power rather than his own. It was in his weakness, his blindness, his lowest moment that he truly understood where his strength had come from all along. His redemption shows that no failure is too great for God to use. Samson was far from a perfect man. He was reckless, arrogant, and often driven by emotion rather than wisdom. Despite his shortcomings, God still used him to fulfill his purpose. This is a reminder that God does not require perfection to accomplish his will. He works through flawed individuals, showing that strength is not found in human ability alone, but in reliance on him. Even today, the story of Samson continues to resonate. It speaks to those who have made mistakes, who have strayed from their purpose, who feel broken or unworthy. His life is a reminder that failure does not define a person. What matters is where they turn in the end. Samson's greatest moment was not when he stood in victory, but when he knelt in surrender, calling upon God one last time. His story is not just about the strongest man who ever lived. It is about the power of faith, the dangers of pride, and the truth that even in our weakest moments, God's strength prevails. If this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment with your thoughts. What lesson from Samson's life stood out the most to you? Also, share this video with your friends and family so that more people can reflect on this incredible story. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more powerful biblical stories.